espionage, hacking, terrorism, economic warfare, political spin, clandestine operations. Unredacted with Rachel Marsden, lifting the black ink to reveal the covert information and intelligence around global events. And now, here is your host, Rachel Marsden.
Hey everybody, how you doing today? Welcome to the show. Get on in here. The stream has started. Whether you're reacting to a notification or you are deliberately tuning in, knowing exactly which time the show starts, come on in. We got a good one for you today. I'm Rachel Marsden, broadcasting to you live from here in Paris, France, one of the capitals of the EU-SSR, the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where we are under heavy censorship from the European Commission, top-down approach, no democracy, because there's a conflict on right now in Ukraine, and we are only allowed to hear about what's going on through official channels approved by the superstate. Not the super state, the supra state, the European Union. And our governments really don't have much of a say about it. So here I am on this pirate channel broadcasting to you, telling you exactly what's going on. We're going to be joined today by a very special guest, an old friend of the show in its previous incarnation, 6-7 years ago now. Jack Devine is going to be joining us in the next 13 minutes. He is the former acting director of operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. He had a 30-year career with the CIA. He is also an author of a book, his memoirs, which is a New York Times bestseller. So we're going to have him on in the next 13 minutes. He also has a very interesting background in the sense that he ran Charlie Wilson's War. If you remember that movie depicted, that whole story was depicted by Hollywood. It is the CIA's war with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union during the Cold War in Afghanistan. And our guest today ran that war and introduced American Stinger missiles in Afghanistan, which are also a topic today, given everything going on in Ukraine. And it seems like that is dragging on and on and on and on. I know that some people thought it would be a very swift operation and are surprised that it's not. I don't know if it was meant to be a swift operation. I also don't know if what we're being told about plans to seize Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine, is actually what was in the cards all along, or if it was just a diversion. We had a guest on the show a couple of weeks ago talk about that very thing, knowing that there are more Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine than Russian soldiers. It would be wise to dilute the number of fighters against you. So it would make sense to create a diversion and a decoy using Kiev and to make the Ukrainians believe that Russians were indeed targeting Kiev, and then reposition after they had kind of been scattered so that ultimately you're facing fewer of them in the area in the east where the priorities claim to be. So we're now seeing fighting in the east ramping up, and it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. And please do keep in mind when you're watching this show, we always caution people to be very careful about what you're reading in the press. If you can't double source it, if you can't, and I don't mean double sourcing because one source was picked up by 4 different media outlets that all tend to have the same editorial line. If you don't have a few different reliable sources for it, be skeptical about it. Because again, we're in the fog of war. You don't really know what's going on. And oftentimes what we see in the moment isn't necessarily what we find happened in retrospect. And history is full of these kinds of examples. So we have other things going on in the world, Boris Johnson and COVID. So I don't know how many of you will recall that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, had some parties, many parties, at 10 Downing Street, his residence, during the COVID lockdown, when he was repeatedly telling citizens of Great Britain that they must stay inside and abide by COVID, very heavy-handed COVID restrictions. And now apparently he has been fined for his attitude of do as I say, not as I do, having parties at 10 Downing Street, his residence, during COVID lockdown. And there are now calls for his resignation. Do you think that that's worthy of resignation? Does anybody even care about COVID anymore? I mean, we're hearing that Shanghai is on lockdown again, and they're reporting a serious situation over there, to the point where the US State Department is recalling its representatives from Shanghai due to the way that the Chinese government is handling the outbreak. Is this ever going to end? Should we be following Shanghai's example? I make no bones about the fact that I think we never should have locked down and followed China's example. And I think there's also a lot of studies out now, reputable studies, you can find them online, saying that lockdowns were useless. So there's also a lot of talk about the fact that there could very well be a whole outbreak of COVID, another wave going on right now in the United States, and nobody really knows about it. But isn't that the best of all scenarios, right? So French election, we're into the second round of the campaign now. So we're down to two candidates, far right, Marine Le Pen, and incumbent president, globalist, let's face it. Let's just say international special interest golden boy. I think that's the most charitable way to say it, rather than just globalist pawn, right? We don't want to be mean, right? On the show, we want to keep it classy. So special interest representative of global special interest, or incarnation of global special interest. That sounds much better. So yeah, they're in a runoff now, 2 weeks of campaigning. And Macron went straight into Le Pen territory and popped up in front of the media to tell everybody, look, I'm going into enemy territory. Isn't Marine Le Pen going to do the same thing? Why does she never go into enemy territory? I don't know, dude. Where have you been for the last X number of months when this campaign has been going on? He flat out said, I won't start campaigning really until I really have to. So he kind of had his first rally a couple of weeks before the first round of voting. Otherwise, his excuse was, I'm too busy being president to run a campaign. So his campaign is essentially the shortest campaign for any world leader in a democratic country. Whether or not that's still the case in name only or otherwise is questionable at this point, given the way he's been treating the campaign. Hey, everybody, welcome to chat. Thank you so much. I see you're all there. You're all falling in as we get rolling here. It always takes a few minutes, which is why I like to do a bit of a preamble and talk a bit about what's on my mind, what's going on, before our guest comes on. Gives them a chance to set up, gives me a chance to talk to you guys about everything that's rattling around in my brain on a daily basis, which is a considerable amount, given all the chaos in the world right now, which it's interesting how the more we head towards a system that is supposed to be harmonized and geared towards stabilization, geared towards stability and lasting peace, the more chaotic things are getting. And it also seems as though the chaos is being driven top down, in the sense that there is a roadmap for every crisis that occurs that impacts the world. And that roadmap is adopted almost magically by pretty much every country that generally is aligned. And what options does that leave us, the average person in those countries? Is there, if everybody's doing the same, like on COVID, like with Ukraine, like with climate change, by imposing carbon taxes and other measures, which seem to be globally accepted by our governing leaders and their acolytes who just propagate the same narratives. What hope do we have of democratically pushing back against that? We have elections, and as we're seeing right now in France, this is a really interesting test case. Because what we're seeing in this election, if you take the far left score and the far right score, which are essentially, let's just leave ideology aside. And I've mentioned this before. This isn't about left-right ideology. This is about the anti-establishment parties, which are the far right and far left, against the more conventional parties. And if you take the score of the anti-establishment parties and add them together, they more than outweigh the conventional party total. Whether it be Macron as a centrist party, which was cobbled together from conventional members of the right and left, recognized members, previous members of government, and officials from the right and the left. Or if you take the absolute drumming that the conventional right and left parties, for example, former President Nicolas Sarkozy's party took in the last election, you realize that if there's any kind of current, any kind of tendency or trend in this election in France, it is the overwhelming rejection of establishment. And it's unfortunate that the far left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, fails to realize that, because the first thing he did in the wake of the first round results, in which he came a close third to Marine Le Pen, is he told his voters, basically everybody but Le Pen, like, you cannot cast a vote for Le Pen. So what is happening is you end up with people who, in his party, I'm looking at the statistics right in front of me here, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, despite calling not to vote for Marine Le Pen, 33% of his voters saying they're going to vote for Macron, 23% saying they're still going to vote for Marine Le Pen, 44% saying they're just going to sit on their hands and not vote at all. If those 44% of Mélenchon's voters can be persuaded to vote in their interests against or in favor of another anti-establishment candidate, like the one they voted for in the first round, Mélenchon, it could put Le Pen over the top. Because as one of the chatters is asking me here, does Marine Le Pen have a chance? The IFOP poll that came out today shows that it's going to be so tight. 49 to 51% for Macron is where they have things standing right now. All right, so I'm going to go straight to my guest, who is, I can see that he's on here, so I'm hoping to be able to pull him up on the screen. Oh, unfortunately, we can't see him yet. Jack Devine, are you with us?
I'm with you, and let's see.
I think we're getting there.
We're getting there.
I got a message saying that you were on, so that's always a good sign.
So I'm clicking on the camera, but
yeah, it's for some reason the camera isn't quite. I see a logo, which means that I think for some reason the camera isn't activating.
I think we're working on it.
Can I give you a couple of seconds? I'll just I'll let you work on that, and we'll come back to you in a couple of minutes.
Great idea.
Okay, we'll do that. All right. So while it's good news there on the line, unlike yesterday, for those of you who joined us. By the way, Xavier Moreau, who is live from Moscow, former French military officer, is going to come on, and political analyst and author about a book on Ukraine, is going to come on tomorrow to make up for the fact that he missed the boat yesterday. Apparently he was confused. He's going to come on tomorrow to talk about Ukraine as well, and kind of the view from where he's sitting right now in Russia. So yeah, does Marine Le Pen have a chance? Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of it will come down to where those far left voters actually go, whether or not they refuse to give a vote to Marine Le Pen, as their fearless leader has instructed them to do, he hasn't specifically said don't vote for her, vote for Macron. He said just don't vote for her, which is why 44% of the voters who went for him in the first round are now saying that they're just going to abstain altogether. Another thing that's interesting is the conventional right-wing party, most of those voters already went for Macron. So he doesn't have that much of a reserve left. He has half of what's left of the 4.8% of overall voters who voted for the conventional right-wing party. Conventional left-wing party was a complete wash, I think 1.8%. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who's turned Paris into a garbage bin, let's face it. It's really not that pretty right now if you walk around Paris, and she's largely responsible for that. Eric Zemmour is really interesting, and somebody wanted me to mention him. Now, he is the journalist who I've personally, full disclosure, I know him very, very well. He's a good friend of mine. I've known him for at least 10 years now. We've hung out, we've had lunch together, we've gone for coffee. So he's a friend. And he ran, and he had a very high initial score in the campaign last fall. And then he made some comments that suggested that maybe during the campaign, that rubbed French people the wrong way, in the sense that they thought it was a little bit harsh, and it actually made Le Pen look a little softer in her positions towards immigration and things like that. So I think he probably did her a favor. By the way, in French overseas citizens living overseas, like in Israel and Canada and the United States, can also vote in French elections. He scored an astronomical, Eric Zemmour scored like 58%. In Israel, he beat every other candidate, which kind of was funny. I'd have to look into the reasons for that. And but his voters, he got about almost 8% of the vote, and it turns out that 75% of his voters, according to the IFOP poll, are all going to go for Le Pen in the second round, and only 4% of his voters are going to vote Macron. 20% are going to abstain, approximately. So there's a margin here, and there's some wiggle room for each of these candidates to work with, namely Le Pen. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens, but this is far from decided. All right, so I think we have Jack with us.
Well,
So
nice
good to
be
see you,
with
Jack. You're looking great.
Sorry about the technical delays.
Oh, that's okay. We're always ready for those. When it's live, you never know. They can happen anytime. All right. So I was just telling everybody here that you served at the CIA for more than 30 years. You rose to become the acting deputy director of operations, the head of the CIA's spying operations. And you're also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Good Hunting, an American Spy Master's Story. You ran Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan, which was the largest covert action of the Cold War. And you helped push the Soviets out of Afghanistan with your decision to supply the Mujahideen with the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. You have experience all over Latin America. And you certainly, I've thought of you so many times since this situation in Ukraine popped off on the 24th of February, namely because I see so many parallels between kind of the proxy war that you oversaw in Afghanistan and what we're seeing now with essentially this conflict between Western NATO member countries and Russia in Ukraine. Now, what strikes you about this? Were you surprised that this has transpired the way it has?
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, Rachel. The only thing is, I want to mention I have a brand new, being last March, a book out called Spy Master's Prism: The Fight Against Russian Aggression. That's the theme. And in the book, I was a year too early. Everyone said, "Oh, Jack, thank you for this book, Fight Against Russia," but it's all about China. So if I pushed it out this year, I probably would have been a lot more popular. But the book is really strictly an analysis of Russia's aggression over a long period of history. But there's a big section on Ukraine, and that it is, I think I described it as the Berlin of the old Cold War. In other words, this is where the action is going to be. And I made a visit there in 2018. This is to your question of surprise. And once you're there, I mean, the Russians have already gone into the Crimea. You understand that there was a real power struggle going on, and that Putin clearly had in his mind. And if you go back, I've said through earlier parts of the book, he was a young officer in Dresden when the Cold War came to an end. and he was burning his files, and he was furious about how it turned out. And I think it's etched deeper in his mind than even I thought. And I thought it was the most impactful thing on his life in his life. And he decided he needed to recreate something that was like the Soviet Union, in which you cannot have, a world power. I mean, he has a world power because of nuclear weapons. But if you strip that aside, he's in the second tier. But with Ukraine, you're now really talking about a much richer country, more people, and the breadbasket. So that he was going to keep working against Ukraine is part of the main theme of the book. That doesn't mean that I envisioned a full-blown invasion, all right? So I thought he was probably going to use all the political subordination and using covert action to turn it.
Mm-hmm.
So even though I'm very proud of the book, and I think I got an awful lot of things right in it, how deeply committed he was to having the Ukraine at all cost was a surprise. That he actually invaded a European country unprovoked and went all out, bombing civilians, atrocity, all out. And so I think there are very few people that I just don't know anybody that thought he was going to go that far. And I was tough on him in the book in describing his mentality, but I think I have a much harsher view of him today than I did just last year.
But is it fair to say that it's unprovoked when we know that Ukraine has been used as an outpost for the State Department for at least the last 20 years? We know that John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Victoria Nuland and other Americans were covertly involved in funding civil society groups to screw around on the Russian border. And we know what happened with Euromaidan, that wasn't a spontaneous eruption of protest, that there was covert action, and that there has been a long-standing interest of the United States to be involved in Ukraine, specifically because it's right up against the Russian border. Is it wrong to say that Putin acted totally unprovoked?
Rachel, very fond of you. But, we've had fun in the past because we disagree a lot. So that covert act, first of all, I want to tell you right now, you're talking to the recipient of the St. Andrews Award, which I think the only other American that received it from the patriarch was John McCain. And I want to tell your audience, I did absolutely nothing to earn it. But, the day I met the patriarch, I was out there, I met a lot of senior people. I was writing a book. I was just talking about the book. I kept trying to convince them, I'm writing a book. I'm not here as representing anybody. But the next day it said, Chief of Worldwide Operations, split the Orthodox Church, the Russian Ukrainian. Now, I could be so good, okay? But that didn't happen. But it appeared in the Ukrainian press, but simultaneously it appeared in all of the Moscow press that Jack Devine personally went out there and did this. And both sides knew it wasn't true, but it was good propaganda. So, what I'm saying is, we're talking about some covert action over a period of time. I get it. There's a world of difference between going to war and killing thousands and thousands of innocent people. But the second thing is, and I don't know when you were last in the United States, but I wasn't kidding when I told you my book was out about watch the Russians, that everybody was saying China. I was in a dialogue with a fellow I have a lot of respect for. He's from Italy, and he's also convinced that, we wanted to make it a proxy war. And I can't tell you how convinced, how committed Washington was going to China. The last thing they really wanted to do is to have this problem today. And I think, if we're going to do the conspiratorial world and this is what they wanted, this is the last thing, I absolutely guarantee you.
So then
the intelligence world, the military world, this is the last thing Biden wanted to see. So
I'm sure, I don't doubt that. But
unprovoked. You're talking about Russia being provoked by Ukraine. Let's be.
But
that's like China being provoked by Vietnam or something.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Invade and take over.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think the focus, Biden really deeply wanted the focus to be solely on China.
The world. I couldn't get.
Yeah.
I couldn't get 5 people in a room to talk about what.
And now things have changed.
People are really forget how different a year ago was on this issue. You couldn't get serious attention on Russia. I mean, really, it screwed up everybody's plans. What Putin did isn't just Ukraine. He has really knocked the world upside down. Alliances are changing. I mean, it's never going to be the same. This is a big play.
Yeah. So the question I have then is, why then was there such an effort leading up to this point to arm Ukraine, to get involved more deeply in Ukraine?
Well, let's stop on the arming. They invaded the Crimea, and all we sent them was Band-Aids. I mean, there was no arms that went in to help the Ukrainians afterwards. So, after Obama left, Trump came in and put javelins in, but it was hardly an aggressive relationship between the Russia and Trump. So the fact that, I mean, it wasn't, we weren't getting ready to build up, a counterweight army to invade Russia. So I'm just telling you, I can understand, and it's a very catchy concept right now. And this is how you build up NATO because it was lost. So you go and create this war. I mean, I'm reading all this stuff, and I want to tip my hat. I've been in disinformation for a long time. But the Russians are doing a first-class job. They got a lousy army doing a lousy job on the field, but they have a world-class disinformation effort, which has convinced a significant segment of the population that they're the victim. But in a world that is seeing so much other information and data, to be able to persuade so many serious people, it is a first-class disinformation. I give them credit.
Well, one of the chatters here has put up an interesting point. Speaking of Crimea, I mean, we know that with Kiev, that was an internal effort to overturn the government of Yanukovych around the time when Yanukovych had refused to sign the EU association agreement. The troubles started shortly thereafter. I'm not saying there's cause and effect. I'm just saying it's an interesting, let's just say, coincidence. Now, all the action, Euromaidan was in Kiev, and the Russians used that as an opportunity to exploit the situation. And as the chatter said, the Russians were hardly going to let Sevastopol become a NATO base. So, it was action-reaction, right?
Two of the countries had already voted that had already made a position that they were voting against NATO. NATO, in Putin's mind, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, but there was no reason to believe in the past 2 years that there was going to be an acceptance of Ukraine into NATO. This is revisionist history.
What was really interesting is, everybody I knew in Washington was saying it was not going to happen. Zelensky privately suspected, he claims it was not going to happen. But what's interesting is it came out a couple of weeks ago, and Zelensky said it in an interview, I believe it was on CNN, that despite the fact that pretty much everybody knew Ukraine was not going to be integrated into NATO, he was told by the American officials to keep presenting that publicly as though it was a thing. Why even bother with that? Why even go there, knowing that it's not going to happen, knowing that it's antagonizing Russia unnecessarily?
But I think there's a different way of interpreting that. Mm-hmm. That isn't to say to Zelensky, look, we're going to get you in NATO. This is a deal. Right? It's different saying, don't give up any concessions until you have to go to the table. Then you give up NATO. There is no reason, and I'm not saying I know I'm the fountain of all information by any stretch of the imagination, but there was no thinking that somehow Zelensky was going to go into NATO after Putin started to move into position to take action. So, whatever people say. Now, remember, you got to interpret it. I'm not saying he didn't say it, but why did they say it? Not because he was going to become a NATO nation. That's not going to happen. It wasn't going to happen.
What's
now he's going to be in the EU because they've created a situation where the Europeans are pulling behind him, and rightfully so, because and you're in Europe, and you're in France, and the other night I woke up early and I turned on, fascinated by World War II. Not that I had anything to do with or lived it, but it was fascinating. It was a documentary, and it shows how the Nazis spread and increased their power, and how the West responded to it, and how Stalin. But the thing that was really informative was the Nazis' actions against the Finns, and how the Finns fought back. I mean, they really held the Nazis. But what you look at is, how does aggression look? How does autocratic leadership and aggression look? And how do those that want to preserve peace, how do they respond? So I think we're looking, if I were in Europe, if I were someone who had lived through it, and there are people that have lived through it, this has to bring back terrible, ugly memories of the Russians.
Well, I think
It really
the
does.
way people
I wonder why the Poles are upset.
what I find is that the reaction here seems to be a lot more moderate than it is in North America. I mean, for some reason, the further people seem to be geographically away from this conflict, the more entrenched their opinions seem to be, and the more polarized their opinions seem to be. Here, I think the attitude is pretty much that
you've got to give the Germans credit for this, a big credit here. When this thing started, I'm not sure the betting was going to say that the Germans were going to step up and cut off Nord Stream. I think, I'm not polling the European population, but I would tell you that I'm mightily impressed how the European nations responded. And I think if I looked at it, I think they were faster on the ball than the U.S. on many ways, and maybe that was by design, but whatever. So that there's great support in Europe for Russia's invasion. I'm mightily.
It's not support. No, it's not.
And how do you swallow all the civilians dying? How do you swallow the atrocities? Unless you want to go to Hollywood and say, "Oh yeah, these are all faked and staged." How can any?
No, I don't think that's the attitude. The attitude is more along the lines. The attitude is more along the lines of
be sympathetic to what the Russians are doing. I find it
no.
Intellectually,
it's not a question of Europeans being sympathetic towards any party in this, other than the refugees who kind of are caught in the middle and had really nothing to say about it. It's more to do with the fact that Europe sees this as an extension of U.S. antagonism against Russia. And they're wondering why Europe is having to pay the price. We're the ones having to pay the price for this.
You said Europe. Europe is not. You can say some Europeans are, but you can't say Europe is.
No, Europeans.
They're sending weapons. They're sending weapons to the.
Well, the leaders are. The leaders are, but the average European person is just caught in the middle, like the Ukrainians, and are going to have to pay an economic price.
If you're convinced of that, Rachel, I'll leave you there with it. But most political leaders want to make sure they got people behind them, and so I think I don't believe the German people are opposed to the Chancellor's going off on his own. I don't buy that. So, but look, there are segments in Europe. Right. I when you go back and watch the World War movie, there were a lot of people that were sympathizers with the Nazis and the Russians, and thought they were they could cut a deal with them, give them Czechoslovakia, give them Austria. They're going to go away. Maybe even Poland when they invaded, not so bad. So yeah, there's always pockets, and thank God that look, I just am stunned by what I'm looking. I can't believe that I'm in the 2,222. I can't believe it. I feel like I'm sitting back in Europe in the 30s. It's 40s. It just is. It's very depressing. I got to tell you, I'm very unhappy. This is not the way. If you follow what I've been saying over the years, I've been saying there needs to be a reset with the Russians.
Right.
But when I look now, he didn't want to reset. In other words, I was wrong. I mean, I said, look, you got to try and reset with this guy. He's Russia ought to be part of Europe. It's
Well,
not a communist country anymore. But I'm
well,
now
how?
convinced. And this is Rachel. This was the one change, one of the changes in my thinking in the past year.
Sure.
Is that it's not his game plan. He is executing a long-standing plan which doesn't call for a reset. He's not interested in it.
Well, then, that would, you'd have to assume that to adopt that position, I think it would only make sense to assume that this is just an unprovoked attack. But how, for example, then do you explain the fact that, according to the Ottawa Citizen, last November 2021, the Canadian covert operations team that worked with the CIA to train the Azov Battalion and other right-wing so-called neo-Nazi groups in eastern Ukraine in order to train them to fight Russians. Why did that even occur? Why was that training even occurring? If there was no intent to aggress or provoke Russia.
This isn't the first time they invaded in your lifetime. They invaded in 2014.
In response to Western-backed unrest in Kiev, though.
So I'm not even sure about the Canadians and the CIA. I don't but
that's true because
let me set aside on the principle, and whether you want to throw in neo-Nazis and all this other nonsense. But the point that I would make is that the West would be trying to support the Ukraine against the Russians covertly. Should not be stunning to anybody. I would support the Russian. I've been outspoken. I was outspoken and critical of the Obama administrations when they went into Crimea. I think they should have gone in much more forcefully with support. Much of Ukraine has been a distraction because, it was a political tar baby, as we would say in the States, in the sense that, people really didn't want to get into the Ukrainian thing because it became such a political hot button in the United States. And sometimes people wanted to be as far away from Ukraine as they could. This is not where they want to be. Fortunately, they ended up with a Zelensky. Came out of nowhere.
Yeah, we know that the U.S. has the Monroe Doctrine, which basically opposes any kind of foreign interference in America's backyard in Latin America. And Latin America very, very well, having worked there operationally with the CIA. Why should the Russians not have the same right with respect to their own backyard like Ukraine?
What's your point?
Why should the United States be over and screwing around in Russia's backyard?
Latin, if you get some Latin, so they're going to tell you, no, we don't agree with the Monroe Program. And not only that, look at the interventions. The Russians are running around now in Nicaragua and the Cubans and in Central America. Castro's gone, but Cuba, Venezuela. So if you want to talk about it, they're doing a lot more messing around than we were in their country. And so after the Soviet Union fell, don't forget, all these countries decided they didn't want any part. You must know that Ukrainians, not all, but there's large segments of Ukrainians that have real difficulties with Russians, and good reason. So, they had democratic elections, certainly more democratic than any Russian election in modern times.
You think that the Ukrainian oligarchy is any better than, you think that's a democracy?
I'm not thrilled with oligarchs anywhere, including,
But, Ukraine, it's not a democracy, right?
I didn't say that. You said that.
Yeah,
they had elections. They've had, look, if you want to.
An election doesn't necessarily qualify it as a democracy, though, as you know.
Well, I don't think if you look at the election of Zelensky, do you think that was a rigged election in favor of Zelensky? The ruling party gives up power. That sounds to me like democracy.
Well, no, I think
you can find in any country, shenanigans. Look, we keep fighting about it here in the United States, but you can't possibly, Rachel, compare the Zelensky election with any of Putin's elections.
Can we compare it with the last election in the United States? Are we still debating the results?
Listen, I'm still a Francophile. You clearly are not an American file. But look, I think the elections in the United States were fair. Yeah, I haven't had a problem. That doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that in some precinct somewhere, but by and large, you look at the election, there was a huge turnout.
What
So,
was really interesting,
so I don't think there was fraud in the Trump election. I think there was fraud in the Biden election.
yeah,
I mean, excuse me. I think they were the winners were the winners. Okay. Now you
yeah.
can go back
Well,
and
I mean, I
ask
don't.
about Nixon or Gore election. They're close elections. You're going to have it, but we have a history of I think it's hard to. I think you'd have a hard case, Rachel, making the point that American elections are more flawed than Russia or China, or take just about any place you want.
But what aspect?
So, I
What
mean,
aspect of
it's not Greece of of Plato or Aristotle, maybe.
what aspect of the Russian elections are flawed?
Or what?
Are flawed?
You think they're flawed? Oh, so do I.
No, no, no. What I'm just asking. I'm asking for your opinion. What aspect or aspects of the Russian elections? Let's take the last Russian
Well,
presidential election. Are flawed.
well, look at the people who are in jail. I mean, Trump's not in jail. We might argue about that one.
Not yet.
Okay, but I'm just saying.
Not yet, but they're going there, aren't they?
Yeah, but it's going to be through legal
Due process.
But they're not in jail. My point is, candidates aren't. The opposition is not thrown in jail in the United States. To the best of my knowledge, they're not thrown in jail in France either. But I mean, there's a case.
Well, they actually
you don't
they
have
are.
to look very far. They just arrested a guy the other day because he thought Putin may not last for a prominent journalist. I don't know him personally. They arrested him because he said Putin may not last forever. I mean, so
Yeah, but these people are arrested and then they're given a
the
$300 fine and released.
Rachel, you can't possibly compare the rule of law in in Europe. Well, let's leave America if you want, but
Yeah.
I didn't do it. But rule of law, and you want to compare it with Russia, North Korea, China. If you want to stick to that game, all right. But look, it's flawed. I mean, democracy was no one ever said it wasn't flawed, but there's a world of difference between an autocrat who's not calling.
I'm not
Maybe
too sure
you're
about
not.
that,
Who's
Jack.
not calling? Who doesn't say that Putin's an autocrat? Anybody you know? I don't.
Well, I don't get involved in jargon and meaningless. I mean,
Well,
everybody's point of reference for what constitutes an autocrat is different.
You were using Nazis a while ago and branding.
But it's because they have black suns on their arm and swastikas.
CIA guys is working with Nazis. I mean,
I'm not calling them Nazis. They're calling themselves Nazis. There's a difference.
There's not a CIA guy alive. There's not a CIA guy alive that would ever do that. Never.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I'm saying is, I think we have a more global.
I never met one. I met a lot more than you ever did.
You never. Well, the Canadians asked the Canadian Defense Department. They're investigating it right now. Why their covert operations trainers were in eastern Ukraine training neo-Nazis with guys with literally big black suns on their arm.
You just said you don't label. Well, I think you just did. But there were trainings, one thing. Okay.
Right.
Okay, but then
now they've been integrated into the Ukrainian.
What makes you a neo-Nazi? I mean, and what other groups? I mean, look, we're getting off from the substance of it. But
yeah, but I mean,
I'm saying to you, let me help you with this one. The covert action, I don't have a problem in providing covert action against the Russians, and they certainly don't have any against us. There's a world of difference between that and organizing a 160 to 180,000 man and woman invasion of another country. That's a different ballgame. And the training wasn't to be offensive, I can guarantee you. It's how do you defend yourself in hard times? Because it'd be silly to think that, let's train the Ukrainians so they can go fight and invade Russia. It's just not.
No, they were fighting the Russians in Donbass.
Yeah.
Which was essentially disputed territory. They were
disputed. Why? Because they went and invaded. I mean, how does that? Sure, that makes it disputed. It wasn't disputed. I mean, you can have disputes. You don't invade.
Well, those are essentially Russian citizens living there for the most part. At least they're heavily Russian culture, and they associate with Russia. I mean, it's even Zelensky considered them to have a special status within Ukraine.
Look,
for that reason. So that was a disputed zone.
I'm not going to walk you back. If you think invading the Crimea and the eastern part was okay in 2014, there's a big gap between us. Okay, yeah. So there's not sense. And if you can condone that, then you can make peace with an invasion and bombing. You can go a long way. I'm not going to argue back. I'm just going to tell you it doesn't work in my neighborhood.
Yeah, but what I'm seeing in my neighborhood is action reaction, and there's no unprovoked attack here. It's a long-standing, slow-burning cauldron of intervention from foreign countries that we've seen in that zone that has finally just popped off into a hot war. That's what I'm
So,
seeing from where I'm
two
sitting here in
people in a
Europe.
bar, start disagreeing, and they get argumentative about the Republican Democrat. A guy pulls out a gun and shoots the other guy. You say, well, they had an argument, and geez, it's understandable he shoot him. So, I mean, I'm just saying, this is from, and I've been in those situations, but where people really burn up and do crazy things, but it doesn't justify it. We have the Oscars, right? So
I can't believe we've gotten to
let's
that
lighten
point.
this up a little bit. Let's lighten it up a little bit. So, so he makes a joke. It's not a good joke. It's out of place, and you go up and punch him, right? So, I mean, you can make that argument, but the Oscars decided to ban him for 10 years. He's a good actor.
Yeah.
So my point is, I understand what you're saying. It just doesn't resonate with me. And, it may be because you live in another place and different friends and so on. But I just want to come back to my first point. The last thing America wanted was to get involved in a war in Europe, in Ukraine, and not be able to do all the other things that they had in mind when they came in. It was completely, if I were Biden, I'd be furious because it's completely changed his game plan of what he wanted to do with the world and what the United States Congress wanted to do, and that was how do we deal with China, and it's a real power. Russia is coming back to Russia without Ukraine is a far less significant player in the world other than nuclear weapon. I put an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on 2 March, and I basically said that Putin actually was punching much above his weight. His status was much greater than it warranted, but it'll never be the same. He will never regain his stature. He will never be accepted in most of this free world. I mean, crossing and carrying out this war has changed the game tremendously. Well, you're not coming to any cocktail party I have.
No more Davos invites.
He's not going to Versailles.
You're not going to Versailles,
and lighting up a cigar.
But still, I mean, there's also the argument that he still has in his group of allies, India, China, pretty much all of Asia, maybe except Japan,
let me
Africa,
tell you something about
Africa, Latin America.
Let me tell you about not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
There's one of my uncles used to call them fair weather friends. You got to look at who's friendly when you're on top, and when you start to fade, who's with you. You think the Chinese are thrilled with this? They're kind of stuck with it. The Indians, it's a really tricky play, and this is I think I'm glad you raised it. In Israel, they've got equities, and how are they going to play them? Which side are they going to be on? But by the way, it's not that they're in Russia's pocket; they're at play, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because India is a place I've visited and have known so many. Somehow being in the Russia orbit doesn't seem it seems to be more of a practical thing. I think it's getting harder and harder for them to swallow it, and because of the atrocity. Atrocities have changed it from seriously ugly to horrific.
But that didn't harm other countries' interests in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq or in Yemen, Syria. So why would it harm Russia's in Ukraine?
I'm sorry, I missed the original. What didn't harm?
The atrocities, or let's just say the impact of war, did not harm other countries' interests when they were involved in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen.
I think this is
so why would it harm?
I think it's a fascinating point, And I'll tell you, it's in everybody's living room. The others weren't. If it isn't covered in France 24/7, it's covered here. It is, there's something, and I'm not minimizing Syria, but it's another thing to have a land war in Europe and have this happening. It's quite different. There have been terrible things in Africa where millions of people, Rwanda, right? Remember all that? And just getting attention on it was so hard.
But we had land war in Europe.
This is the modern age. It's in your living room. You actually see it.
But we saw that in Yugoslavia as well, and that didn't harm any NATO member countries.
Well, I'm just telling you, here in the United States, I mean, maybe it was covered better in Europe. This is stunning here, and Serbia was, disgusting, but you're minimizing how people view Europe in the context of the world, and the European nation. Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that to you. That.
But we've had wars in Europe. We've had land wars.
You sure have, and we're going to go back and look at them and how they got started and how they were created. That's what I recommended.
Yugoslavia.
My first 5 minutes was to say to you, go back and look at how World War II rolled out, and how the behavior and what people can do to each other. I mean, the Flanders Field. I mean, the capacity for Europeans to kill each other is stunning. But it looked like it was in a dormant phase. Now it comes back, and it comes back with all the horrible memories. That's what you're seeing here, is the undertone of World War II that is still fresh in a lot of people's mind.
Well, what's more fresh?
You can't find the different countries in Africa.
Well, World War II isn't that fresh in people's minds here. What's more fresh in people's minds here in Europe is the war in Yugoslavia, which was essentially a NATO.
I'll leave that to you and your comments.
Okay, but I mean, I'm just talking about people who've been around. I mean, I'm 47, so I don't really remember World War II, but I do remember the war in Yugoslavia. I was attached to the TV for that war.
It helps you remember the Cold War, so that helps. So we can
Coke
still
Wars.
buy it.
The Coke Wars, the Pepsi War.
But if you don't know about World War II, it's time to go back, because France went through hell.
Yeah,
and if everybody's forgotten, they need to go back and look at it. Look, America is the same. We need to go back and understand our own history. But it isn't that long ago. Let me tell you. And the people in the policy arena haven't forgotten it. That's why you have that reaction. Why do you think the European leadership? It's not because Putin combs his hair the wrong way. This is on the home court, and they've seen this before.
Yeah, but we saw Serbia bomb for 78 days in the late 90s as well here in Europe, and that's more fresh in people's minds.
So
right. So it's not. This isn't
But this is in Serbia. This is in Serbia. If you want to make it Serbia, well,
how is Ukraine different from Serbia?
Well, because honestly, I think it's a much bigger country, and it's part of the real Russia. How does it remain its power base? Not that it remains. How does he build his power base to what he has a dream of, which is adding all of the stands and all the Baltic states? That's where he's headed at minimum.
But how do we know that? Like, we're assuming that, but how do we know that that's what he really wants? How do we know he just doesn't want economic cooperation with former neighbors?
Do you think for you was that he wanted Ukraine a surprise?
Pardon? That he wanted Ukraine?
Surprise? Yeah. Was it a surprise?
Wanted Ukraine? What do you mean by wanted Ukraine?
Well, he wanted to be part. He wanted the Ukraine's been outspoken. Ukraine should be part of Russia. Period.
Who said that?
So were you surprised?
Who said Ukraine should be part of Russia?
Putin.
Oh, we did? When?
Yeah.
I don't recall that at all.
Well, you may not recall it, but
no.
He gave a speech not too long ago, within the last month, talking about it needs to be the Ukraine rightfully belongs. There isn't a Ukraine. That's what he said. There wasn't Ukraine. It's really part of Mother Russia.
Here's the other. Okay, that brings up a really interesting point. How do we know that what's being conveyed in the American press and European press is fact and not just conjecture and not just convenient framing to orient people towards a certain way of thinking? How do we know it's fact when what we see on the ground is really just impacted by the fog of war at this point? How can we know that that is bankable information and not propaganda?
Yeah. So how do you know facts are facts? I mean, I was in the intelligence business. The way we looked at it is, do you have confirmation? Do you have multiple sources? Now, look, I don't want to confuse. One of the beauties of democracy is that you have diverse opinions. And there was a great movie, Vantage Point, and it was involved in assassination. And what happened is different people saw it from different angles. So there's legitimate reason for disagreement in political discourse. And that's why you have political parties in democracies. But the interpretation, what does it mean that Putin went in? Now, there's where there's room for disagreement about facts. But what are the facts? Russia invaded Ukraine. They did.
Yeah.
They bombed, killed a lot of civilians. Okay, so what are the facts? And then you can tick them off. But then you can say, well, when did he know? When did he decide? And then reasonable people can disagree about it. So, but he has a long record of comment and talking about, and has a vision, and it's on the record. You can find it. And as I said,
I don't know where that record is, though.
No. Look at last month. There was a speech in which he talked about the Ukraine isn't really a country.
About Ukrainian being.
No, it's a long history. It was covered broadly everywhere.
That's what I'm talking about. We're getting back to the whole how reliable is the information that we're reading. How do we know?
Rachel, it's a good question. At the end of the day, you can argue about the facts, and you have to take each fact and dissect each fact, right? You can't do broad sweeps.
Yeah, I agree.
But but at the end of the day, there's sensibilities about things. And if you think Putin is a good guy, really interested in the welfare of the world, and has mankind's interests, and has humanitarian feelings, and is not up to aggression and violence, that's you can have an opinion like that. But I would submit his behavior, would suggest that this is a guy and Russians have a history of aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine. So, I'm not sure what fact, you want to diagnose, but I would say there's a broad sweep of history that.
Yeah, we know that there's been.
Republicans and Democrats agree. You got to start worrying. When the liberals and the conservatives agree on certain things in whatever country.
Well, it seems like whenever it comes to foreign conflict, that's what brings Republicans and Democrats together in the United States, which always seems to be the case, regardless of where that is.
Well, I wouldn't tag it the United States. It brings countries together.
I don't know. What I'm seeing is I don't have an opinion on the actors involved in terms of their personal qualities. I don't really care, frankly, what they're like as people. What matters to me is the ground truth.
Do you think it was a mistake for him to invade Ukraine?
Pardon?
I'm just asking. Do you think it was a mistake for him?
I think history will show whether or not. I think we'll be able to have more. I think hindsight will be 20/20. I think there's a lot of elements we don't have yet to make a conclusion like that.
We've always worked on a fair plane here. You're asking me, and I'm telling you. Okay?
Yeah.
Now I'm asking you. Do you think it was he right? Was it the right thing?
I think it's far too early to make a judgment on that.
Oh, Rachel, you're very brave on your comments, but
I'm not ideologically driven. I'm interested in ground truth. I'm interested in objective analysis.
I'm not sure that's exactly right. But if you can't answer the question, was he right? Was it the right thing to do?
What do you mean by the right thing to do? That's a good question. The right thing to do.
Was it the right thing to do?
How do you define right?
Well, is. I mean, let's not go there. I mean,
Yeah, well,
you
I
think
mean,
was it
how
the
do you
right,
the right
yeah,
in moral sense, the
ethical,
right in the
moral,
militarily, the right in the
right?
Russian
No,
interests sense?
take it all. Ethical, moral,
I don't think there's any room for ethical and
morality,
moral.
no room for ethics.
I think that's a dangerous, slippery slope to get into when we're talking
Well,
about geopolitical interests, because each
so
country is going
he
to
did
do
it.
what's right for
He
their
did
own
it.
interests.
And you're a citizen of France, and he did it.
I'm a
And
citizen of
you're
Canada, actually.
okay. Yes, that's good. That's even better. But you disguised it.
I did.
So you're acting.
I disguised it with my
You're telling me
wonderful
about
French
Europe, but
accent.
we never talked about Canada. But you've seen the event. Was this a good thing for the world? Did he make the right move? Was it a decent move? It's not hard. It
Every
really isn't. It's
single
not 2020, and it's not where we're going to be a year from now looking at it.
right.
I mean,
But
I
every
think
war we've seen in the last 3 decades, including the one you were involved in, I mean, would you say that was the right thing to do?
the Russians are absolutely wrong in invading Afghanistan. Is that what your question was?
No, my question was, do you think America?
Was
No,
it right for us? Was it right for us to push back?
but do you think it was the right thing to do for the world to get involved in a
I
war
get back to what I
with
said. I think
Russia, with the Soviet Union?
I'll give it to 2 parts. One,
Yeah.
it was a mistake for the Russians to go in to Afghanistan. And in the context of the Cold War, I would do it again to support the Mujahideen against the Russians.
Which
Yeah, so
brings us to
I don't have any
today,
problem
which
with
is
that.
exactly the same position.
And I
do
would
you think?
support today. No one's asking me, but I would sure as hell support the Ukrainians against the Russians. I wouldn't have any problem against that.
I'm not surprised. Do you think?
Neither is Germany. Neither the Germans. Apparently, the Czechs, the Slavs. No one seems to have a problem with supporting them now.
Oh, really? Ask the people of those countries who are basically
Well, all
ignored
I
in
can
terms
go
of
is
our.
by.
We're the ones paying for it.
I can't go up and down the street and take every German's name and vote. But I'm just telling you, those governments, unless you're saying all these governments are anti-democratic government, I don't know where.
Anti-democratic governments. No, they just
Well,
don't care about what their people think at this point.
Well, see, I can't speak of the
Yeah.
chancellor doesn't care about German people.
But I mean,
I'm surprised they get elected if they don't care. I'm sure
well, they barely do. I mean, sometimes it's just a matter of not having a very good opposition.
Rachel, we can't win these arguments. Okay,
But I think getting
I'm proud
into
of the Europeans. I like the way they're behaving. Give me, here's a chance for me to say, the Europeans are doing a stand-up thing. And look, there's some people that
we're paying for it. That's for sure.
When the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, the U.S. did not want to get into World War II for the longest time. So going back to it, there were a lot of people that resisted, or thought that you could make a deal with Hitler in Europe. Sure, there were. A lot of them died. So people are entitled to their opinion, but of course you're not expecting everybody in Germany and France or Belgium or whatever to agree. But my sense is the leaders tend to understand where their people are coming from. Not all, but where they want to be. And again, I believe in the democratic process. I believe in elections. All right. Now, is every election fair, and is it a referendum, and can there be a problem? For sure. But it beats letting one guy or one gal come to the top and just decide what's going to happen to you or me. I want to have a voice, even as quiet as mine may be. Yeah.
And we're in the middle of a 2-round presidential campaign here in France that risks being very tight. Second round voting shows that it could come down to 51% versus 49%. Macron centrist kind of establishment candidate.
I'm watching it.
And far right.
The whole world's watching it. I'm listening for your predictions.
Yeah, and you know what's really funny? This is always something that blows my mind as somebody who's lived in France for 13 years but isn't from France. Election night, polls close at 8 p.m. On the television, right at 8 p.m. or at 7:50 is the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way to 1, and then boom, the results. And of course, those are fine-tuned a little bit by next day when the actual results come in, but they're pretty much what you're going to get. And it's as a result of accurate exit polls, and they're very well done. So everybody pretty much knows what's happening the second polls close.
So,
It's crazy.
Rachel,
I
I'm going to leave
could
that to
never
the French.
understand how that worked, but it's
I'm going to leave
impressive,
that to the
frankly.
French people to resolve, right? But
Yeah.
you have a mindset that is different than mine, and that's why I enjoy talking
sure.
to you.
I love talking to you
stimulating.
too, and that's
But-
why I wanted to have you on.
And I'm smiling. I'm smiling not because I find it it's enjoyable, I guess. And it's important to hear how the other side of the spectrum views a problem. And as I said, and I did give the Russians high praise for disinformation, that they've been successful in getting their message out as broadly as they did in the free world is a real tribute to it.
In the free world,
But
I'm not sure if the free world's getting the best information at this point either.
The good folks are still holding tight.
We could get into the philosophical debate of which side is actually responsible for disinformation during this Ukraine conflict. That's a whole other debate. What I qualify as disinformation may be not exactly what you qualify as disinformation.
I don't have any trouble defining my position on that.
No.
We'll save that for the next show. Okay?
For sure.
But
it's always a blast talking to you.
In deep suspense. The audience will remain in deep suspense.
The audience is having a good time in chat. I'm watching some of the comments and they're having a blast. Lots of debate based on our conversation and our interaction here. So you made their day, you made my day. Thank you so much.
I'm reading some of them. It just, it's you have an interesting audience, and it's
yeah. Well, it's international, it's independent, so everybody can come in, everybody's welcome, and everybody can join in real time. Sometimes there's two shows happening. There's the one we're doing here, and then there's the one they're doing there.
I just want to say that
yeah.
How deeply I feel that the world is in a very dangerous place, and this event has rocked it, not just in the context of either Ukraine or Europe. It has so many knock-on effects.
I agree.
That peace is really what is needed.
Yeah.
And even after that, there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects. But why we may have kidded back and forth, this is deadly serious. And I will tell you, in my long years of the agency and since in the intelligence world, I've never been as troubled as I am today about the consequences, no matter where you put them, of what it means. And the sooner people can get back to a more peaceful environment. And it's a shame that the League of Nations and the United Nations never fulfilled the founders' dreams that there's a way to bring mankind together. But this is a bad moment in history, no matter how you cut it, no matter where your audience is coming from.
Yeah.
This is a very, it's a life-threatening development that impacts every country, no matter how far away you are from Ukraine. So let me end on a hope that somebody will find a path forward for peace.
Yeah, I agree. I think everybody's looking forward to that and hoping that there's a resolution in one way or the other sooner rather than later.
Right.
Yeah. Jack, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And I had a blast. Thank you. Always love debating you. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, wherever you are.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. That is it for today. I'm just trying to, there we go. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Jack Devine. He's the former acting director of operations of the CIA. And we are fortunate enough to be able to have him on the show today. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And if you want to rewatch this program, because it was a great discussion debate, which I always am thrilled to have with Jack whenever he comes on the show. I think the last time he came on the show, if I remember, it was several years ago, and it was right in the middle of the war on terror, and he spoke about his love of drones. And I talked about whether or not they're really the way to go when you're dealing with counterterrorism operations. Maybe the operation should be more involve more surgical operations of special forces personnel, and we had that debate. So whatever the conflict may be, we always really get into it on the show, and it's always a great pleasure to have him on. So, and I want to thank him again for that. You can watch this program again on the platform you're using right now. It will be up forever. So please feel free to rewatch it, send it to your friends, send it to your parents, whatever you want to do. Make someone's day. But it was a really good debate of the issues, and it showed the clash of two specific worldviews on this issue. And I love shows like that. They're really interesting. So hope you guys had a good time. Hope you learned something. I think dialogue is the best way to handle any conflict, and I love chatting with people who don't hold the same kinds of views that I generally do on any particular issue. It's particularly ones that matter as much as global conflicts. So thank you. You can check out my website, rachelmarsden.com. And just to let you know, there is going to be another column posted, I think today, on the French elections and what's at stake for the second round in 2 weeks. And there will also be another piece out regarding atrocities in Ukraine and what the United States is looking to do against Russia at The Hague, and how there's a little bit of hypocrisy involved in that scenario. And I'm going to get into the details of it in the column that comes out later on this week. So watch for that. It'll be posted at rachelmarsden.com. We will be back again tomorrow night, just to let you know. We're going to have a guest on, former French military officer who is a political analyst and also a businessman who has been living in Moscow for many years, who wrote a book on Ukraine and the French perspective vis-a-vis Ukraine in the wake of Euromaidan. And he also was going to tell us a little bit about how things are viewed from where he sits in Moscow, because are we really getting that perspective to the extent that we need to understand how these two opposing pieces of this conflict puzzle fit together? I don't know. I try to get that on the show. So we had Jack Devine, 30-year career at the CIA, and we're going to have some other people from the other side to talk about what they think. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back again tomorrow. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be